Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the, I believe Carolee just said 171st straight episode of History Matters, and so does coffee. We're going to talk about, I see a huzzah there. It's very 18th century of you. We're going to talk about mentors and mentorship and some of the influence that sort of relationship can have on people, historically speaking and otherwise. But before I launch into that, I turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will reveal the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History. I'm delighted, as always, to be with you on Friday mornings. We will continue to engage in the chat. We always have a very active chat group going on all throughout Joanne's talks. But if you have questions, especially on this topic, and I'm very excited about this particular topic. If you have questions, please put those down in the Q&A and I will look for them in about 30 minutes and we will have a discussion. See you then.
Excellent. Okay. And someone already has bingo and someone else found the obscure TV commercial I was just singing. So Facebook, you missed a classic song, I'm sorry to say, but we are here to begin the episode on mentors and mentorship. And I'll swing back around at the end to talk about why I chose this topic. The one sentence version I'll say is that someone who was a mentor to me died last week. And oddly enough, I hadn't really thought about him as a mentor until people started saying, I'm so sorry you lost one of your mentors. And I thought, he really was a mentor. So anyway, that led last week to this idea that we would talk a little bit about mentors and the kind of influence they can have, as I suggested when I tweeted, skeeted, posted, spouted, tooted, whatever the heck I did about it, that, mentors for better and worse. That's what I want to talk about today. Oh, and I will say, those of you, if there's anyone here who is here for the first time, please let everybody know, make sure, as Annie said, that your chat is set to everyone, because we have a robust, wonderfully healthy, engaging community here after 171 episodes, and they will give you a rousing welcome if you will tell folks that you're here for the first time. Okay, but man, like I turn off chat so I don't see chat, and on the bottom of the screen I see bingo. Okay, now I want to start, as I often do in these conversations, with definitions. Right? Definitions are always a good way to start, and actually any work, when I am writing any kind of historical article or doing any kind of historical research, very often, no matter how obvious the meaning of a word seems, when you look it up and very specifically look to see how it's used in the period you're writing about, you learn amazing things that drastically change the meaning of what you started out reading. So in this case, I don't think it's going to drastically change anything, but I at least wanted to read it. And there are all kinds of definitions floating around. According to the American Psychology Association, which managed to put it concisely, mentors help people determine who they want to become, how they must change in order to become these people, and how they can take advantage of their college or work experience to bring about these changes. Obviously, mentors can be a kind of model for people. Mentors can help people develop in a far more pragmatic way. They can help you network, right? They want to mentor you, they want to help you develop, and then they connect you with important people that it's useful to know. We'll actually be talking about one example of that today, and that's, I won't go into implications of what was just decided by the Supreme Court on affirmative action, but one of the things that going to college generally and elite colleges does is connect you with people who will mentor you in every way that I just described, including connecting you with people of influence. So that question of access, giving people access to people who can act as mentors in a variety of ways that might not be readily available to everybody, that's a big deal. That's a huge deal. And I don't think I saw it really being talked about in light of the Supreme Court decision, but it's a really important one. And one of the things I asked you last week, and think about it, think about if there's someone in your background who took a personal interest in your career and guided or sponsored you for better or worse. We may get a chance to talk about it during questions. We may talk about it a little bit during the after party. Okay. So obviously your mentor can shape your thinking, your actions, the trajectory of your life or your career. In the realm of politics, a mentor can shape your career profoundly, both in your political method and again, in networking. You learn what works. You model yourself after the people you are being mentored by. And ultimately, whether you're doing it very deliberately or not, you often try to do the same thing, particularly if it was a good experience for you. You learn, oh, well, that's what a mentor is. And ideally, you pass it forward, you do it again, but it can have a really profound influence. Now, there were two people that came to mind today, one for better and one for worse. And they're not going to be shocking because they probably would come to mind for a good many people. But two examples of mentoring and mentorship and the ways in which they influenced the particular people I'm talking about here. And one of the people is Thomas Jefferson, because Thomas Jefferson wrote a lot about his mentor at the College of William and Mary, William Small. He goes to the College of William and Mary, which I think at the time was having a kind of tumultuous period. I mean, Virginia schools of higher education generally were tumultuous in this time period, just rowdy boys being rowdy boys. UVA, certainly that was a problem when it came along. But at any rate, Jefferson goes to William and Mary. He studies, I want to get it precise here. He studies philosophy, natural philosophy, and a variety of other topics kind of along those lines, right? And he becomes close with William Small, who is a professor of natural philosophy and mathematics. Jefferson was at William and Mary from 1760 to 1762. Small was educated in Scotland. He had the Scottish Enlightenment flowing through him. He was immersed in Enlightenment philosophes, Newton, Bacon, Locke, which actually Jefferson declared them the three greatest men that ever lived, Newton, Bacon, Locke, Adam Smith, all kinds of others. He goes to Williamsburg to join William and Mary, the faculty, in 1758. And apparently he was the only non-clergyman on staff, which I probably would also attract Jefferson to him, who was not ultimately that excited about priestcraft. But at any rate, what Small did for Jefferson was, first of all, introduce him to people, which was very useful. And, you know, people like the governor of Virginia, but also he introduced him into a circle of men, and so many of these mentors. And I found an article from the 1970s when I was looking around to see, generally speaking, what people say about mentors. This was like 1973 or 1975. It said something like, you know, some huge percentage of people said they had some kind of mentor, and all the mentors were men. I'm shocked. At any rate, so certainly in the time period I'm talking about here, all the mentors were men. William Small introduced Jefferson to George Wythe, who becomes kind of a legal profession mentor for Jefferson. But most importantly, there was a dinner, a regular dinner, I don't know how often it met, but pretty regularly, that featured Small and Wythe and Governor Fauquier, I hope I'm saying that right. Annie will correct me later if I'm wrong. Who the governor of Virginia, and they would sit around the table and they would talk and think great thoughts, right? They were these lofty conversations that were a kind of education for Jefferson. And I'm going to read a quote from him right away, but sitting there, he learned about that kind of a group of people, these sort of philosophically minded Enlightenment thinkers, someone who was a lawyer, someone who was a teacher, and someone who was the governor of Virginia, a man of power, and Jefferson. So there were a lot of lessons that he could learn there, partly lofty thoughts, partly he's seeing a man of power engaging in this kind of behavior. That certainly would have been, if not a lesson, certainly an opening of a door as to what you can be. Because remember, in this time period, elite gentlemen were assumed to be, in their future, they were going to be public men, right? It was assumed. When you look at Jefferson's letters to younger people, nephews and young men who he wants to mentor, he will say things like, when you enter public life, not if, when. It's sort of assumed. And so here you have Jefferson at William and Mary getting a particular kind of education in public life. And Jefferson talks about it a number of different times in his writings. I want to read you one quote from him. This is from 1815, and he's looking back at his college education. He said, Dr. Small was George Wyth's bosom friend, and to me as a father. To his enlightened and affectionate guidance of my studies while at college, I am indebted for everything. He first introduced into both schools rational and elevated courses of study, and from an extraordinary conjunction of eloquence and logic, was enabled to communicate them to the students with great effect. He procured for me the patronage of Mr. Wyth, and both of them the attentions of Governor Fauquier, the ablest man who ever filled the chair of government here. At these dinners, I have heard more good sense, more rational and philosophical conversations than in all my life besides. They were truly Attic societies. Wonderful little nifty description of just what I'm talking about here, which he puts into words. It had a formative effect on him. And that's not the only quote like that, right? He's attesting to precisely what I'm talking about. Now, what's interesting is when you think about Jefferson as a politician, he was a dinner table politician. That was his mode of politicking. He liked to get people around a dinner table, which didn't quite feel political and yet could be very political. And it seemed like you were just having conversation, but you could do a lot of things around a dinner table in a non-confrontational manner. I can't directly say, he learned this in William and Mary and then said to himself, I must be this kind of politician. But it's striking that this formative experience in his early life helps, with the governor of Virginia there, helps shape pretty much the mode of politicking he adopted for all of his adult life. So first of all, on a purely pragmatic level, it shapes him as a politician, and that, joined with the ultimate ideology he has, ends up really shaping what he represents as a politician, and it sort of feeds into the Jeffersonian ideology of, less hierarchical maybe than the Federalists. Again, you can't draw direct lines, but what you can say is that early William and Mary experience shaped him profoundly in a lot of ways, affected his politics in a lot of ways, and at a formative time in American history, probably had an impact on the formation of the United States as well, or certainly the mode of that formation because of Jefferson's place in that process. So that's just an example of, basically some older gentlemen kind of took Jefferson in and mentored him and shaped his thinking and his actions and his politicking for the rest of his life. And you can feel in the quote that I just read, the affection that he had for these mentors, right? That he feels clearly that they gave him something personally, and he was a younger man and he learned from them. You can it kind of beams out of that quote, precisely what a good mentorship relationship can be like. Now, I'm only going to talk about it briefly because I don't want to run out of time. one of the things that I then thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to look at this, would be to look at Jefferson and Madison as like the next step. And generally speaking, I wouldn't say that Jefferson was Madison's mentor, but at the very beginning of their relationship in the 1770s, the mid and late 1770s, definitely Madison is looking up to Jefferson and trying very hard to sort of please him in some ways. So it has the feelings of the relationship of mentor and mentee. They go on to certainly go way past that and become profound friends. But I want to just read you an early letter from 1780 from Madison to Jefferson, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, because probably your sense of Madison, if you have a sense of Madison, is like the guy, Mr. Constitution, father of the Constitution, thinking great thoughts, sort of out there, is a practical politician, ultimate president. Here he is writing to Jefferson in 1780. I have written several private letters to you since my arrival here, which, as they contain matters that I should be very sorry should fall in other hands, I would wish to know had been received. If your excellency has written any acknowledgments of them, they have never reached me. And he signed the letter, I am, with great respect, I am your excellency's most obedient and humble servant. Now, obedient and humble servant is kind of a cliche. So, that's, I am, dear sir, your most obedient and humble servant is the equivalent of, best wishes or whatever we put, yours truly, or the things you put at the end of a letter and don't think about. But the tone there of Madison looking up to Jefferson and, oh, goody, look at that. I don't know how to turn that off. So now there's people apparently texting me in the middle of this. So my apologies. At any rate, you can feel the echo of a mentor-mentee kind of relationship there, which again doesn't last, but is striking and shows, in a sense, a chain, a mentor-mentee chain, which I think is one of the really positive things that can happen with mentorship relationships. Now, the other mentor-mentee relationship that came to mind is not necessarily on the side of the positive, and I just couldn't resist it. It's not going to be a shock to any of you, and that's Roy Cohn and Donald Trump. That's quite a relationship. And in a way, ultimately, Trump meets Roy Cohn when he's acting as a lawyer for the Trumps. But it's very clear that, and I think this is his cousin that says this, Roy, oh no, it's an attorney in Cohn's office who says Roy gave Trump the tools, all the tools. So Cohn was this aggressive, assertive lawyer. And I'm going to read you some quotes about him. According to an attorney in his office, Roy couldn't have given less of a boop about rules. He did whatever he wanted. He felt he was good enough at everything to get away with it. And he did that for a very long time. The more unscrupulous he became, the more his law practice grew. He was the man to see if you wanted to beat the system. Now, he ends up, he becomes infamous because he's the chief counsel for the red baiting Joseph McCarthy during the Senate hearings in the 1950s. During his career, Cohn was indicted 4 times from the mid-60s to the early 70s for stock swindling, for obstructing justice, for perjury, for bribery, for conspiracy, extortion, blackmail, filing false reports. He was acquitted 3 times, and the 4th trial ended in a mistrial, which gave him a kind of sheen of being indestructible, right? That rules don't apply to him. See, he potentially, seemingly did all of these things and paid no price for it. He's just above the rules, and he owned that and flaunted that fact as part of his armor. He himself said, he told this to Penthouse magazine, I decided long ago to make my own rules. He didn't pay bills. He didn't pay taxes. He meets the Trumps, Trump and his father, in I believe it's the 1970s, when the US Justice Department sues the Trumps for violating the Fair Housing Act and discriminating against Black tenants. And Cohn does what Cohn does. The government had evidence. Cohn had Trump countersue and then attacked the character and reputation of the attorney he was up against, attacked his credibility. Now, in the end, 1975, I think this was 73, 1975, there's still debate as to who won that case, right? Because Trump signed an agreement, both Trumps, saying that they were prohibited from, quote, discriminating against any person in the terms, conditions, or privileges of sale or rental or of a dwelling. And the Trumps were ordered to, quote, thoroughly acquaint themselves personally on a detailed basis with the Fair Housing Act, which is barely a slap on the hand, right? Trump says something along those lines. He says in his autobiography, in the end, the government couldn't prove its case, and we ended up making a minor settlement without admitting any guilt. You can see how Roy Cohn was a kind of mentor in spirit, in method, in manner, almost as a model. I mean, we've certainly heard in current times, former President Trump at some point, I think, said, where's my Roy Cohn? Because he's always looking for lawyers. But beyond that, in addition to whatever he thinks of Cohn as a lawyer, you can very much see the way in which Cohn shaped Trump, just in what I described right there, which is a very superficial account of Cohn. I could substitute Trump's name and much of it would apply. So again, there's someone who provided a model, showed someone, in this case, Trump, what could be done if you had the guts to do it. If you decided you were above the law, above all rules, Cohn did it, Trump does it. He learned lessons from Roy Cohn. Now, I want to just briefly say one last thing here before I open things up for questions. And that is partly why I wanted to have this episode about mentors. I've had, I guess, a number of mentors in my life, and I feel very grateful for that. I've had two people who were my main mentors. And one of them was my graduate advisor, Peter Onuf, who is still a mentor. At the beginning of my time at UVA, we were given a sheet of paper and told to list the name of our mentor. And I used that wording on the sheet, which I thought was comical. And so I began addressing him as mentor from that moment on. You are my mentor. And he began addressing me as mentee. And over the years, that's become dementor, dementee, tormentor, tormentee. It's had a lot of different variations over the years. But the fact of the matter is, he guided me, gave me advice on being a historian. All of that was beyond valuable, but equally valuable was him being a model as a mentor. He was sort of ready to go wherever his students wanted to go as far as what they wanted to study, right? He didn't seek students who only were interested in what he was interested in. He went with them, he guided them. He can really sort of see what you're trying to say and what your strengths and weaknesses are, and he fosters them. I have called him forever mentor from heaven, because I do not know another mentor who is as focused and giving and generous and earnest in the way that he is a mentor. I feel very lucky to have had him in my life. And part of why that's important is when I have graduate students, I desperately try to live up to the Onuf example, right? And it's not as though there was a conscious thought where I was like, he was my mentor, I must pass on the mentor heritage. It was more like, wow, what a mentor, what a model. If I can begin to live up to that, I am doing my job as a graduate advisor. And that's the gift of mentorship, right? That's the gift of it, is that someone shows you ideally what can be, what a fostering, nurturing, positive kind of relationship, no matter what your job is, can be, and ideally speaking, you want to pass that on to others. I used to say to grad students, being part of the Onif tree, because Peter Onif's advisor was Jack Green, who was a very similar kind of attentive, engaged, thoughtful, understanding person who could really see who his students were. I say to just any grad students, but certainly mine, you want to be part of the Jack Green mentor tree. It's an excellent tree, right? Jack Green, great mentor. Peter Onif, great mentor. Joanne Freeman, really trying to be great mentor. You can just see the chain of mentoring, and I think that means everything. I think it's also good that there's a woman in the tree. I'll say that. And I didn't talk about it, but there is all kinds of interesting stuff online about mentors who are of your same gender and race versus not. And it doesn't say that, you should dismiss or not be engaged with mentors who are different, but when you are with mentors who are similar, it means something. And I will say, when I was first, as a grad student, invited to give a lecture at the Smithsonian, and I was, I believe, a first-year grad student, to give a lecture at the Smithsonian History Museum. And I realized I had never heard a woman historian speak before an audience. All of my professors at that point had been male. So I actually went and found, as a matter of fact, full circle here, in Williamsburg, Virginia, there was an event, and Joyce Appleby and Pauline Mayer together were doing some kind of program. And they taught me what it could sound like, what a woman with authority in front of a group of people could sound like. And in the case of Pauline, her wonderful sense of humor, how you could even be yourself and do that. I needed that voice in my head. And Pauline ultimately became a mentor too, later on in my career. Now, the last thing I'll mention, which is really the main reason why this topic came up, and I won't go into detail. If you want to see the ways in which my friend Richard Bernstein was a mentor, I wrote a tribute to him last week at some point, I don't know when. And I didn't explicitly say, let me explain how Richard was a mentor, but when you read it, you can actually see all of the ways in which he was. And to the point that I didn't think of him that way, right? He didn't come across as, and probably this is the best kind of mentor, he didn't come across as, well, child, let me tell you what to do. He was my friend. He was my friend for 38 years. He was my friend. That's how I met him. He was already a practicing historian. I started out as a receptionist at an ad agency, trying to work my way up to being in production in advertising. And I met Richard. I can talk about this more in the after party, but I met Richard. I was volunteering at the Hamilton Grange National Park site. They wanted me to learn how to do exhibits. They sent me to New York Public Library, and that's how I met Richard. And it was the first person. I had been reading Hamilton's writings at that point for at least a decade. I was right out of college. So this is 1984. And no one had ever asked me anything about Hamilton, and I didn't know there was anything I could do with that reading. I was just doing it because it fascinated me. Richard was the first person to ask me what I thought about Hamilton, and I answered for 2 straight hours. And then we were friends. But, for 38 years, he was there. He helped at the beginning me get consulting jobs as a historian. He pushed me to go to grad school. He introduced me to people who could help me find a good advisor / mentor in grad school. Every single thing I wrote, every podcast, he loved this webcast. He watched it. He wasn't in the community doing it live, but he watched it every week and emailed me every week to tell me what he thought of it. He was always there. He saw everything, and he commented on it. And he didn't comment on it like, well, you did better. That was a B+. He would more say, you're really good at this stuff. And what was strong about this one was this being a mentor. And, part of what mentors do is when you falter, a mentor is a person who says, you got this. Like, I see you. As a matter of fact, Rabbi Beth, lurking out there, I wrote a eulogy for Richard last week. I delivered it at his funeral. And Rabbi Beth was kind enough to read it over because I didn't know what a eulogy was supposed to sound like. And she said, when she read it, Richard saw you. And I added that to the eulogy because that was correct. So, Richard was an amazing mentor who was also a friend. I didn't feel that we weren't equal ultimately. I just felt that I looked to him for support and guidance. And he was always there. And that's a good mentor. That's the best kind of mentor. Not judgmental, just there for you, sees you, supports you, backs you up, and helps you go further, sees what you can do and helps you get there. That's why I wanted to talk about this today, in part as a tribute to my friend Richard, who I actually still can't believe is gone. I don't know when that will go away, but at any rate, I'm going to stop. I went way over, but I chose this topic in part so that I would have an opportunity to talk about what a great mentor he was. Okay. Oh, Mug, thank you. I will stop talking, but not before the mug. Now, I had a very hard time this morning trying to decide what the heck, Mug, mentorship? And then I decided if someone were to ask me as a mentor type person on History Matters, what I would suggest it would be History Matters and so does Newbie.
I love it. That is
It also says
perfect.
Oodling for Democracy every Friday morning. I believe that's a Carolee mug.
Yeah, oh yeah, that's definitely a Carolee creation.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
So that gave me a chance also to use this mug, which
Yes.
makes me very, very happy. Oodling for Democracy every Friday.
Ruling for democracy. We need
and I
to
just have to
say
show
that.
you the other side. B to B to B, oodly beep beep. So that's in Newbie language.
That's right. Oh my gosh, that's hilarious. Did he perk up when he heard his name just now?
He's upside down showing his butt, actually.
Oh, nice. Thanks for mooning us on a Friday morning.
Someone found my tribute to Pauline. Yeah, Pauline was an amazing member too. Anyway, I want to open this up. I'm going to open chat now.
I put Peter Onuf's last backstory when y'all did those best of episodes towards the end. I put that in the chat so everybody
Nice.
be able to go back, because Ed has told me so many Peter stories stories about all of y'all during that time, but
Peter is unto himself unique.
Yeah.
I'll tell you one goofy story and then we can talk. Peter likes to improvise. He just likes to riff. He's the riff master. And there was one occasion, I wasn't there, when he was speaking before a pretty big audience and walking around the stage and knocked over a potted plant on the stage and bent down and repotted it as he continued with the lecture.
So he's a master gardener / historian.
That's my mentor. Anyway.
That's awesome. All right, well, we have lots of great questions.
I
So
Rabbi Beth is leaving, but I got to thank her. Okay, excellent.
Yeah. Okay, our first question. This is a long one. This comes from our friend Dave. Dave asked, please compare and contrast mentoring and networking. Ooh. Seems like mentoring is nurturing and initiated by a mentor, while networking is something started usually by the one trying to build the network. I'm thinking of a network studies at Ivy League schools establish, undergrads to some extent, but especially law school and MBAs. For example, how many SCOTUS justices were from non-Ivy League law schools?
Well, exactly. That I mentioned it very briefly at the outset, but part of what the affirmative action quashing does is cut that off for people who are less advantaged, because that's part of what mentoring is. So mentoring has a nurturing component to it. Mentoring has a modeling component. You see someone and try to model yourself after them. There's also just a crass, pragmatic part of it, which isn't necessarily crass, but your mentor introduces you to other people, right? Jefferson is a great example of this. Networking can be part of mentoring. You meet the people your mentor is engaged with. They see you as someone to take notice of because they're friends with your mentor. It matters a lot. So I wouldn't say that those are two separate things, networking and mentoring. I would say that networking can be part of a successful mentoring relationship, but networking can happen without that. right? And I'm sure many of you have examples of that where you met someone and that someone was like, yeah, you should meet so-and-so. That's more networking, or even better. I used to do this all the time. I was really out there to like make something of myself. I would manage to meet with someone. I had this diehard, super successful system of meeting with presidents of organizations. And I can talk about that in the after party too. But I would say to myself, I cannot leave any of these meetings without another name.
Yeah.
In some way or another, I need to leave so that there's someone else I can contact. So I don't know what those people thought they were doing, but that was me creating networking. But at any rate, I think they're related and they can be meshed, but they're not identical.
Yeah. Carol Lee always teases me and calls me the Kevin Bacon of history teachers. Which I think, that's a fun moniker to have, I guess. It makes me laugh. She put it on a mug, actually.
Oh.
Okay, here's a fun question from Scott. Hi, Scott. He asked, who was Hamilton's mentor?
I thought about that. And I thought about talking about that this morning. I didn't, but I thought about it. So he had a couple different kinds of mentors. One of them was from the Caribbean, Reverend Hugh Knox, who just saw him as a poor, illegitimate, really gifted kid who needed help to make something of himself. And Knox got together a charitable fund so people would give to it so he could go to college, right? And then when you look through Hamilton's writings, Knox stayed in touch with him. Hamilton was reporting with him. So that was an early mentor. But, there were other kinds of mentors. There were, he comes to the United States and he's an illegitimate guy with very little money who came from somewhere away, right? He was, I must have used this before, a mushroom man, 18th century term, sprouted out from nowhere with no roots, right? That was their term. So that could be a distrusted kind of a person. So he met older men. He was very good at impressing people, not just to be like, conniving Machiavellian, but also because he was gifted and smart and energetic. So he won a lot of supporters and mentors that way over the years. And again, when you look at his early life in the United States, you see someone at King's College, Columbia, professor like loaning him books, and you see a variety of different people stepping forward to try and help him move on. I think he tried to be a mentor for his nephew, but he did that a little bit in ways that were bemusing, but maybe not useful. I'll give one sentence and then we can go back to questions. Hamilton was a practical joker, and he wanted to give a fake seance at some point, and this is when he was Inspector General of the Army during the Quasi-War. He wanted to give a fake seance, and he got his nephew to go with him to get the guy who was famous for giving the fake seance. If you're the nephew, I don't know what you're learning.
That's hilarious. Yeah. I love a good prank, I will say. I've been known
to surprise me.
Yeah. Giving away all my secrets. Okay. Dale from Williamsburg, you mentioned Williamsburg earlier. Our good buddy Dale asks, thinking of Jefferson as a mentor to men who will go into public service, what do you think about his mentoring letters to his daughters?
Well, that's really interesting. I would say those are not mentoring letters. They're parental letters. So the letters he's writing to young men are, rules to live by, how to educate yourself, read these books. They're sweeping. To his daughters, he's very focused on what they should do in a different way. You don't write me often enough. You should write to me more. How are you doing in your studies? He didn't, he was not forward thinking in his views on the education of women. Let's put it that way, in a diplomatic way. Heather always jokes that I always say things that could be unpleasant in the most diplomatic way. It's a great example. But when you read the letters he writes to his daughters, and there are some that are, that are harsh. They're a little more 18th century parenting is different, but at one point he says to one of his daughters, something along the lines of, this is going to be a bad paraphrase. Do this, behave well, or I won't like you so much, or it's a horrible, blunt way of putting it. It's not as blunt as that, but it's like, to please me, you darn well better do this thing, or I might back away from you or something. So that's not mentoring, it's parenting. He cared about it, but he did not see them going on to have lives outside of the home. And he certainly wasn't the person to give them advice on how to run a home. So those were different relationships.
Yeah. Jean asks, has the relationship between teacher and students changed over the years? The idea a professor would have students visit their home for a meal and discourse is more problematic in today's world than prior generations.
So, repeat that for me.
She was wondering if the relationship between teacher and students has changed over time, that, the idea of a professor having a student over to their home for a meal nowadays might be problematic.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so it's interesting. So when I was in grad school, which is like 25, 20, I don't know how many, long ago when I was in grad school, there was a famous historian whose work I used in my dissertation. And he invited one of my male colleagues in grad school to his house for dinner to have an intellectual discussion. And I remember thinking, I could never say yes to that invitation because I'm female. I could never. It would not be appropriate, even if nothing happened, even if the guy was great. That would not be something that I could do. And I remember at the time, some part of me was like, wow, it's like a little tiny feminist awakening, like, that's not fair. But yeah, I think that can be problematic. I think it as our consciousness of different kinds of relationships has evolved, that becomes more complicated. I think those kinds of assumptions about relationships between mentors and mentees of men, women, aren't static, they change. But I definitely think, in semi-recent times, yeah, that's something you really have to think about. If you're going to be a mentor, you don't want to do something that's going to be bad, invasive. You want to be nurturing and supporting without crossing lines, because that's the way that you can be most helpful.
Yeah. I mean, this is terrible. I could have gotten fired lots of times over the years. But in my early teaching, a lot of parents knew that I was struggling to make my student loan payments, and they would hire me to babysit on the weekends. And a couple of parents hired me to either come stay at their house with the kids, or like I took them to my apartment because they wanted to go to things downtown, and I lived in Richmond and they lived outside the city. Nowadays, you would get so fired for that, taking a student to your house overnight. But my nephew was the same age as the kids I taught, and when I had 3 nephews, I would always grab a couple extra kids when my nephews came to visit and take them to like a basketball game, or I never thought of it. Now you would get so fired for that. It's sad that way, but
it is sad. At the end of every semester, I would invite my undergrad seminars, 15 students, over to my house for pizza. Partly because it's like, I bet they've never been in a professor's house.
Huh.
It's 15 students. So, I didn't think anything of it. I really think now about doing that, in part because, it involved them taking a shuttle to come to my house, and there's all kinds of,
right.
These were simpler times. It was really nice to be able to do. And I know that many of them came away thinking differently about what professors could be and what college was. They told me, right? So that was good mentoring. But it's complicated.
Yeah. Okay, Sydney, our friend Sydney asks, what makes a good mentor? Are good mentors universal, or does a good mentor depend on the person being mentored?
Oh, maybe a little of both. That's such a historian answer. I do think a mentor, as I said before, sees you and is mentoring you. and not just tossing off advice. On the other hand, there are things a mentor should do, like support you and prop you up if you're feeling shaky about something, and tell you the things that you need to know and do and learn if you want to do what you want to do, and tell you the brass tacks, like the facts, about what it means to, if you're going to succeed in your profession, your form of business. I remember Peter saying to me, and he was right. So here's what's going to happen when you go on the job market. This is my first semester, first year in grad school. Here's what's going to happen when you go on the job market. There are going to be 10 jobs in your field in the country. There will be 200 people trying for those 10 jobs. And the same 10 people will be offered all 10 jobs. So, and I said, so you're either one of the 10 or you might not get hired. And he was like, yes. And he was right? He was right. I saw the same people going back and forth between interviews when I was lucky enough to make it into the 10, but that was important. He wasn't being mean. He wasn't trying to dissuade me, but that was important to know. I had someone do that at Yale for me too. An older colleague said, here's what's going to happen. Your book is going to come out and it's going to win an award, and then Yale will want you to stay, or your book will come out and you won't win an award and then you'll have to go away. And I was like, okay, then. Like, I don't have control over that, right? But and it probably, the truth was not quite that, but there was a lot of truth there. So that's part of it too, right? You need a mentor to be realism for you, so that you're not investing a lot in something that may not be possible.
Yeah. All right. Dale asks, given Cohen's flaunting of the rules, would comparing Cohen to Burr be a reasonable one?
Ooh. That's interesting. Cohen and Burr. Creative question.
Very creative.
Well, Burr's superpower was not so much assuming that the rules didn't apply to him. It was being cagey. It was not revealing what he thought. It was not putting things in writing. It was being charming and getting people to sort of reveal themselves to him without being vulnerable in return. And I think he was opportunistic. And thus, in that way, hey, I could do this and it'll be great for me. And maybe it's slightly shady, but I'm going to try it anyway. I don't think he was like a Cohen sort of, to heck with the rules, I shall do what I want. I think in that time period, anyone who did that bluntly and blatantly and tried to have political power would certainly be noticed. This is the age, Burr's age, when if you look ambitious and you want to be in political power, you should not ever be given political power, right? An ambitious man should never be given power. And thus you have the weird, masking of the time period in which people run for president by going home and not saying anything. I don't want to seem like I want to be president. Or George Washington, after his second term, begins packing things up to go back to Mount Vernon. And John Adams sees this. Like, oh, he's packing up his furniture. He must be making a play for a third term. So you don't want to be that. That's a whole different standard. But so I think it's related, and that Burr kind of did things that weren't quite according to the rules. But Cohen, I think, was on his own level of just really fundamentally thinking he was above all rules.
Okay, we have a very interesting question, and I don't recognize this name, and I hope I'm not mispronouncing it. Thais or Thaisa Baxter. Welcome, Thaisa, if this is your first time, or if you've been with us for a while, but this is the first time I recall seeing your name pop up in the Q&A. But the question is, was Madison and Jefferson's mentor-mentee relationship part of the reason why Madison changed his opinion on the size and role of the federal government in the 1790s?
Well, I guess I would say Madison's view on that is complicated. Hamilton basically said yes to that. Hamilton was like, Madison was my friend, and Jefferson came back from France all pumped up with his importance, and he stole Madison away from me and made him change his views. Madison said in his old age that the reason why he changed his views about the federal government were because, I want to get this right, Hamilton tried to administration the government into being something it was never intended to be. And he used a noun as a verb. And apparently, according to the witness who was talking with him, had a little smile like, I like the way I use that word. And what he meant was that Hamilton was trying to, use administrative means to make the Constitution more than it was intended to be. So the fact of the matter is the two men agreed on a lot during the Constitutional Convention and after. And once the government got going, they didn't necessarily agree. Now, Jefferson, he was there, he's a friend, he's a mentor. It was natural for them to connect and work together. And Madison ultimately is kind of like sort of a lieutenant, except not really, because, he's an equal in thought. So I don't think Jefferson is totally responsible for it, but that helped, right? And the two of them together, the fact of the matter is, for a while, it wasn't Hamilton versus Jefferson seen as the big fight. It was Hamilton versus Madison. Jefferson comes in as the main character a year or two after that opposition starts going. So it's kind of a mix. It's another historian answer. It's complicated.
We have so many good questions. Okay, Kathleen asks, who influenced George Washington the most? Like, who were his mentors?
George Washington's mentors.
He's the first one.
I know what kind of mentors. Well, I'm trying to think about if I have specific names. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I'll start generally. Anyone in Virginia of a generally elite status would have been looking to other Virginians of generally elite status. So he would have been generally in that kind of a circle of people and kind of getting guidance as to what he should be. He did not have any kind of mentor, certainly for being president. How could he? He was the first, as you just said, Annie. And that was a real problem because he didn't know what it was or how to be it. And there was no one he could ask. So he's just kind of inventing this on the fly. And then people are responding, either loving it or hating it or a little of both. And he's kind of trying to figure out what to do. I think he really would have loved to have a mentor at that moment, and he really didn't. But he also has a different kind of a background, right? Plantation owner, surveyor. He's not philosophical and steeped in education in the way that someone like Jefferson was. So it's a very different kind of beginning for Washington.
Someone asked if possibly Lord Fairfax might have been a mentor.
It could be. I'd have to go back and okay. So Dale has an interesting question there. British generals. It is true that Washington learned his skills and method as a general during the Revolution from his service in the British Army in the colonial period, right? And he adopted some of the same practices. So it was during the pre-revolutionary era, when the colonies were still colonies, that the people who Washington was serving under did things like calling the staff of officers around them the family, right? They would say, my family. And when Washington becomes commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, he does the same thing. He refers to, his staff of aides as my family. So he certainly, in the ways that I've been talking about here, did look to see what was happening around him, did adopt things that he liked, and then did have the chance to deploy them when he assumed the same role. So that's actually a good suggestion.
Okay, I'm going to squeeze in at least one more, even though we have 4 more left. Miranda, our good buddy, asks, what can you do if you lived in an area where mentorship was not really emphasized and you never had one? How could you go about getting someone?
That's a really good question. Well, so here, this is goofy, but here is a thing I did. It was actually at the advice of my father, who was good with practical stuff like this. He said, when I graduated from college, and this was particularly true when, like the year you graduate, he said I should make a list of the presidents of companies in areas that I wanted to work in. And I wanted to do TV production, and I started, ad agencies. I made a huge list of the presidents, and I wrote a letter that went out to all of them. And the letter was essentially, I'm graduating from college, and I think I want to go into the field that you're in, and you're someone who has influence in that field, and I would love the chance to talk to you about what you do and your thoughts about it as I'm deciding what I want to do. And then there was like a paragraph that said, these are the things I'm good at. Would you be willing to talk to me? And I met with like 12 presidents of ad agencies, like the ad agencies, the HR people. They were like, we have never seen this before. And I got a job that way, right? So that was finding a way to ask for advice and actually really asking for a job. But so I do think there are ways that you can look at your position in life and where you are and what kinds of questions you're asking. And even though in my mind, I was like, I want a job, I went to these people and it was sincere, right? Tell me about what you do and what you like, and I'll learn about it and I'll come away with another name. But that was really crafty. My dad was smart. That was really effective. So that's one way. That's one, there's other ways, but I think you have to find a way of sometimes it can be friends of friends that'll help you get there. And sometimes it can just be finding ways to have conversations with people that in which you're not demanding anything. You just want to learn. And there will be some people who will want to step up and help you do that.
And I think we have the technology now, which is a bonus to
Yeah.
make it a lot easier. I put in the chat earlier that over the 21 years I was in the classroom, I had 14 student teachers, and 12 of them are still actively teaching, which I think is pretty darn good considering how many people are leaving the profession.
That's
and
very
2
good.
of them decide to stay home with children and raise their family, but I'm still in touch with all of them, which is crazy.
Which is
It
wonderful.
also says how old I am, but a lot of them say it's because not just me, but other teachers in that building stepped up and nurtured them so much those first 5 years. Like, we really took care of our baby teachers, as we used to call them. Like, you get over saying that now, but they did it for me. Like, people did it for me. And I was in the same building for the first 19 of my 21 years in the classroom. It was a family, and they looked out for each other, especially the newbies. And newbies. And it was a unique, I don't think every school had that magic, but we were so lucky. So, yeah.
And Tim makes a good point too, right? Thought of people and asked himself, did he want to do what they want to do, is another smart way of doing it without even necessarily making contact with that person. But if you're looking for a model, looking for someone who you might want to model is another useful way, even in an abstract, indirect way of getting that kind of connection and advice.
Yeah, I remember when Charles Barkley had that "I'm not a role model," he was saying that, and I think there was an ad campaign where he's like, "I'm not a role model," but he was. Like, every boy that I taught in that era looked up to him, and so he can say he's not a role model all he wants, but when you put yourself out there as a public figure,
I want to comment on what Carolee said, because I think that's important too. Sometimes you don't, for any number of reasons, you don't feel inspired or confident enough to go and have that kind of relationship with someone. I was not. I was the person in college that didn't really talk in class. I did have a mentor in college, but I don't remember quite how that happened. But at any rate, it's important to know that, as Carolee says here, you can find people that you can, like I went and found Pauline Maier and Joyce Appleby, right? You can find people to act as mentors. In my case, I actually got to meet Pauline Maier, and then that became that relationship. But even if I hadn't, I could see that she was a powerful woman historian who had fun with what she was doing, who laughed and made jokes when she did lecturing and teaching. That was big for me. You know, she was powerful, she was brilliant, and she was human. So it's very true. You can find people who model what you want to be and make them a mentor of sorts, sometimes without necessarily even having contact with them. Although if you can figure out a way to have contact, sometimes that can be a good thing.
Yeah. I had put in the chat, I don't know if you saw this last week, Joanne, you know, Montpelier's had a lot of unrest in the last couple of years around their leadership.
Yeah.
And last week they announced Yola Dance is their new CEO and president. And Yola was a park ranger with me at Maggie Walker House in Richmond when I worked for the National Park Service in the summer as a teacher. And then she was at Fort Monroe more recently, and they just announced her as the new CEO and president. And I was over the moon thrilled. Like, even 5 years ago, I never would have seen a woman, much less a woman of color, leading Montpelier, given what had been going on there. They'd done so much good work, and then they tried to tear all that down, but the staff didn't allow it. So I'm really excited to see what that next chapter at Montpelier will be. If you guys come to
one last thing, and then we're going long, so we have to.
Poor John.
But I do want to. I know for John, I want to say one last thing. So first off, Carolee, I'll take that title. I totally will take that title, right? So Carolee says, well, whether I want it or not, I'm a mentor. But what I wanted to point out is, where is it here? Laura G says, Carolee is a heroine to me. So, you know, Carolee is thinking, well, here's someone I consider a mentor, and here's someone else that says, well, Carolee, you're somebody I admire. There it is, right? There it is. That's the kind of giving and taking that can really change the world.
Yep.
Okay. I'm going to stop because we're going long. Yes, we do mentor each other in this community. At any rate, I want to thank you for being here, engaging in the conversation of democracy on another Friday morning. And I hope you come away from this conversation thinking about not only the people who've helped you, but the ways in which you might be able to mentor others, because I think it's not something you naturally think about, but once it's sort of in your brain database, you might be more prone to do it, particularly nowadays when everything is so unwieldy and chaotic. A mentor could really mean something right now. At any rate, thank you for engaging in the conversation of democracy on a Friday morning. What we are going to do right now is go to the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording, so that we can speak even more freely and more easily, less formally, as though we've been very formal, but we can be even less so. And if you have beamed in through the NCHE website, just stay right where you are, and poof, you will be in the after party. If you are watching us on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and join us at ncheteach.org/conversations, ncheteach.org/conversations, and then poof, you will be in the after party too. I want to thank Annie and John, as ever, for being wonderful people who join me every Friday for this, and for all of the ways in which a little tiny hat comes out for making this possible in so many ways and being wonderful to work with besides. And I guess it's what's wonderful is seeing all these people saying nice things about each other and other mentors. It's like, oh, that makes me so happy. For if this is the Richard Bernstein conversation, that makes me happy. At any rate, let us segue so that we can have our poof moment. For those of you who can't stick around, I will see you next week. And okay, recording